thanks to all of you for joining us today for this program. The Ready and Education Committees are thrilled to introduce Dr. Lawrence Brown to the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle. I want to repeat Vivian's earlier words, that while the Circle has addressed the consequences of structural racism in our grant making and educational programs, we have not done a deep dive into the causes of structural racism and the systems that created it. Today, we'll take a look at the history and policies that led Baltimore to become hyper-segregated. As individuals and as an organization, we need to understand how we got here in order to effectively address the problems we face. Back in the fall, as we looked into speakers to educate us on this topic, Dr. Lawrence Brown quickly surfaced as the undeniable expert. His research on hypersegregation and its causes is anchored in Baltimore, where from 2013 to 2019, he served as an assistant and associate professor at Morgan State University in the School of Community Health and Policy, and where he launched the Be More Lead Free initiative. In 2020, in partnership with the University of Chicago Center for Spatial Data Science, Dr. Brown directed the US COVID-19 Atlas Work in Response for the County Health Rankings and Roadmaps program. He has been speaking about the Black Butterfly of Baltimore for years. In fact, my Zoom background is a 2018 painting of that same name by local artist and author Chris Wilson. Based on a lifetime of extensive research, Dr. Brown founded and directs the Black Butterfly Academy, a virtual racial equity training and consulting firm. And we'll add that to the website in the chat shortly, or we'll add that website. Dr. Brown's recently released book, The Black Butterfly, The Harmful Politics of Race and Space in America, could not be more timely or important. It is an informative analysis of Baltimore and the United States history of racial segregation and urban apartheid. The book also suggests compelling solutions to dismantle them, and we highly recommend reading it. I've never underlined or taken more notes while reading a book. Dr. Brown will be speaking to us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. And that part will be moderated by Ready Committee member Maggie Osborne. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat as we go along. It is now with great pleasure that I turn the program over to Dr. Brown.
All right, thank you, Cricket, and thank you to the Baltimore Women's Giving Circle. I really appreciate this opportunity. I'm very thankful to share with you today a little bit about my work and the topic that I'll be discussing, mapping Baltimore apartheid. Thank you, Cricket, for extending the invitation. And it's great to see that beautiful painting that Chris did as well. So I want to start by offering my condolences, and I'm thinking about the Atlanta shooting and the 8 people killed there, 6 of them women, 6 of them Asian women. And I'm actually going to tie into that, and you should hopefully see the connection by the end of my presentation, but my thoughts go out to them and indeed all Americans who are struggling with the pandemic and then the ongoing epidemics of gun violence and racial violence in our country. So I want to, with that in mind, share this presentation, Mapping Baltimore Apartheid, and I touch on a lot of the things that you can find out more about in my book, but I think seeing it this way visually, hopefully is a compliment for those of you who've been reading, and then hopefully if you haven't read it, this can trigger some things that will make you go and take a look at the way I flesh some of these things out in the manuscript itself. So I'll start with zooming into this big, beautiful map of Baltimore. And I always love seeing a map of Baltimore City. I'm a map nerd, and seeing this map is always beautiful to see. And so we zoom in, hope I didn't give anybody vertigo. This is Central West Baltimore, and looking at a newspaper article from the Buffalo Commercial in 1902. So roughly 100, we haven't hit May yet, so 118 years ago. And here we have, it's a bit cut off, Negro invasion. Pay attention to this language, Negro invasion. White residents of one of Baltimore's swell sections up in arms. So we have Baltimore, May 7th, the invasion of the western end of Druid Hill Avenue. That's in West Baltimore, Central West Baltimore. One of the approaches to the park by Negro residents is, then Black people at this time were either called Negro or colored, so we're going to see that language, is damaging real estate values and arousing hostile feeling among the white residents and property owners. For several years, the Negroes have been gradually getting possession of property in a section at one time one of the best in the city. As they get into the white neighborhoods, property values depreciate. They newly occupy fine old houses within a stone's throw of Madison Avenue and Utah Place. And so there was a colored laundress. Her name was Fannie Williams. She was the first to move into the color line. And it says, as a result, the white neighbors are making it very unpleasant for her. Saturday night last, tar was poured over the front marble steps. Windowsills were smeared and broken and panes of glass smashed. And she appealed to the police, but they do not seem to be able to catch the vandals. And when the patrolmen's backs are turned, the attacks are resumed. And so they decided to place a guard at the house, and residents of the neighborhood say they are determined to drive the Negroes out of the block. So let me come off of share because I want to ask a question. What was the rationale that we saw in this article? What was the rationale we saw for not wanting Black people to move into this formerly all-white block in Baltimore at the time? And we saw that the rationale was the notion that Black skin, if a Black person moves in, that it will result in a depreciation of property values. Now, I can't see everybody that's on the webinar right now, but by nod of head, is this notion still with us? That Black people in a neighborhood, I just want to check, everybody's nodding yes. Yes, this notion is still with us today, that Blackness is connected to the depreciation of property values. And so we see that Baltimore 1902, this language was being used in newspapers, and it would have a very serious effect later on. So this is a picture of City Hall. We know what happens in City Hall. This is where the laws, the ordinances, the governance of the city takes place. And so there's this wonderful, well, historically speaking, wonderful article from the New York Times Magazine. And it was written in 1910, actually on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1910. In this article, Baltimore tries drastic plan of race segregation. Strange situation which led the Oriole City to adopt the most pronounced Jim Crow measure on record. And so you can actually pull this article up using a search engine and just type in New York Times, Baltimore tries drastic plan of race segregation. You should be able to pull up a PDF of this. It is worth taking your time to read this. Very fascinating because it talks about the man in the middle, Baltimore Mayor John Barry Mahul. He ends up signing on December 19th, 1910, 110 years ago. He signed the first residential racial zoning law in American history, right here in Baltimore City. You had the city council on board. This is council member Samuel L. West. It was his ordinance. The mayor signed it on December 19th. And what had happened was this Black man right here, George McMecken, he moved into 1834 McCullough Street in the Upton community or the Druid Heights community. And he did what African Americans do. Yes, we can. We are moving on up. We finally got a piece of the pie. We're going to move into a better neighborhood. But the white neighborhood said, no, you can't. And we have the evidence right here in the middle of the screen. This is a picture of his home. What happened to the windows? You can actually see this bigger hole right there where the neighbors threw rocks through the windows. They picked up bricks and they threw it through the skylight of his home. They were doing the same thing they did with Fannie Williams' home. They were trying to intimidate this person who was home buying while Black and attempting to scare him and his family, his wife Anna and their two children, out of their neighborhood, um, and to maintain racial exclusivity. So we see how real estate, housing, is playing and the composition of neighborhoods, how this is all playing a role in trying to sort of maintain urban apartheid in Baltimore. And because of that violence, that was the intimidation that was being exacted against the the family of the McMeckins, uh, in the summertime. I believe what happened is that the white community in Baltimore, which we have to remember this, Baltimore was a majority white city all the way until the mid 1970s. So this is a city that has been shaped by this racial history, and for the longest period of time, up until the middle of the 1970s, majority black city. So the white Baltimorean population, I believe they understood that Baltimore had a pretty sizable black population. It wasn't the majority, but compared to other cities, Baltimore had a higher percentage than most other cities outside of the South. And so what they figured out was, okay, maybe using violence isn't a good idea, because there's always the possibility that these Negroes might fight back. So let us use the law. And so this was the point, December 19th, 1910, that Baltimore turned to law, an ordinance to enforce racial segregation. And if you can read that, that's City Solicitor Edgar Allan Poe, not the poet, but the grandnephew, if I'm not mistaken, of the poet by the same name. He's the city solicitor at the time. So absolutely fascinating. And actually, under this picture, it may be difficult to read, but it says where the Negro invasion has depreciated values. So even in this article, you see that language of Negro invasion. So now we go to North Central Baltimore, and this might be a place that many of you are familiar with, because we're talking about the Roland Park community. And really, the Roland Park Company, they developed this portion of Baltimore. They developed four neighborhoods: Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, and then later in the 30s, the Northwood community. So this gentleman right here, Edward Boughton, he was the general manager. And by 1912, he had pioneered, and as a result, or he had pushed for, and then the Roland Park Company pioneered the use of community-wide racially restrictive covenants. Now, what are restrictive covenants? I have to come off of the share sys so I can talk to you personally. So what is that? A restrictive covenant is like the deed to your house that you receive when you buy the home. So congratulations, you're a new homeowner, and you're reading the deed, and it says keep your yard cut, keep your shrubs trimmed, keep your driveway clear, and oh, by the way, when you sell your home, you cannot sell to any Negroes. So that is a racially restrictive covenant. Now, African Americans were explicitly barred, but actually the Jewish community was implicitly barred. And this was through the use of a private investigator. They sent a lady out, and she would look to see signs of Jewishness, of what people are wearing, what menorah, or what they have in their household, if they're observing Sabbath. And if she found signs of that, she would go back to the office and say, we cannot sell to this household because they're Jewish. So Baltimore, and you find this out in Patella's book, Not in My Neighborhood. He talks about how Baltimore had like a three-tier system of racial segregation. So white Anglo-Saxon at the top, then Jewish folks, and then Black folks at the bottom. And so the sophistication of this, of how the Roland Park Company helped to pioneer racially restrictive covenants. Now, at this time, 1912, much of the land that they owned was actually north of the city, because the northernmost boundary of Baltimore until 1918 was Cold Springs Lane. So, but there is part of Roland Park that's south of that, and therefore in the city. But what you're seeing is that because of that, Baltimore County is also implicated. Baltimore County was also And this is true for many urban areas, the urban and suburban spaces and places conjoined and worked together to enforce urban apartheid. And so the Roland Park Company pioneers, and then there's a company in far west Baltimore, they copycat and used the same technique, and that was the Forest Park Company. So you had developers that were using racial exclusivity to promote the selling of their homes and to build their elite communities. And you can read more about this from this article in Johns Hopkins Magazine. So now we come back to Central West Baltimore. There's just a lot of activity going on in this area of the city. So we're in 1913 now, and here we have the introduction of the Baltimore Sun. And now the Baltimore Sun is using this language: Utah place threatened by Negro invasion now, in these big, bold letters. What is that all about? Other streets involved and property owners will meet tonight to plan resistance. Oh my goodness, is a resistance? The Negroes are coming, and we must plan a resistance in Baltimore City. Now, I want you to pay attention to what the Baltimore Sun is doing. Look at this: a threatened invasion of Utah Place and the 1 and 200 blocks of West Lanville Street by Negroes. It is rumored that a Negro family is seeking a house in the 1600 block of Utah Place. A dwelling in the 1900 block of that beautiful street is already owned by a Negro. Over here, one Negro family moved into the 1700 block of McCullough Street a week ago. Down here, it was said last night that Negroes were also after property in the 13, 14, and 1500 blocks. My goodness. The Baltimore Sun is giving play by play. They are announcing the rumors. We heard that Negroes were coming in over here. We know a Negro already lives over there. They were putting Black people's business out in the street and alerting the white community. So you see the Baltimore Sun playing a powerful role in helping to establish and enforce Baltimore apartheid. So that's 1913. Then we go back to Northwest Baltimore, and now we have the Mount Washington community. They get involved in the story. And so, for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize this article. You have my former institution. I'm actually doing some work with them now, Morgan College, which would become later Morgan State University. They wanted to move into Mount Washington. And here we have the introduction of neighborhood associations, the Mount Washington Improvement Association. They worked to block Morgan College moving into that community. And they worked with the next mayor after John Barry Mahul, and he was the Honorable James H. Preston, mayor of Baltimore, who actually wrote a letter saying he thought that the establishment of Morgan College would have a very serious effect upon property values. There goes that argument again, at Mount Washington. So another fascinating story and incidents, but now we see a different mayor and a different community. And interestingly, we already saw earlier Buffalo commercial. Here's the St. Louis Star and Times. See, other cities were following Baltimore very closely because Baltimore was the first to do it. And they were off, these other localities around the country were often interested in doing the same thing. And so here we have the St. Louis Star and Times. Baltimore and race war over invasion of Negro whites fight to protect home districts from Black residents. October 23rd, 1913. Don't have time to read all of this, but again, this is what is happening in Mount Washington at the time. By the way, I had a wonderful opportunity. I want to say it was the Martin Luther King holiday. I talked to the Mount Washington Improvement Association about their history, and they were just very fascinated and eager to learn, which was wonderful to see. So I had a great chance to talk to them about and share this information with them, so they were able to see it. So we moved back out to Baltimore, the big map, and now we go to Northeast Baltimore in the Laurelville community, and we're at a juncture 4 years later, 1917. And so Morgan College is on the move again. Remember, it was blocked from moving to Mount Washington. Morgan College, by the way, was formerly in West Baltimore, in the Upton community. But it was growing. It had received, I believe, a large donation from Andrew Carnegie, but with the condition that they needed to move to get a bigger campus. So they're trying to move to fulfill the terms of that donation. And now they want to move to Laurelville, Northeast Baltimore. And Baltimore Sun is at it again. Fights Negro invasion. Laurelville is up in arms against Morgan College. And then they go on to say, Laurelville has blood in its eye for any invasion of its 99% pure white community by a Negro institution, colony, or settlement of any kind. And once again, see, I have the receipts. I like having the receipts. We get the primary source evidence because we see the neighborhood group is involved again. Laurelville Improvement Association. Frederick Evans, we even have the name. He was the chief spokesperson. And the way, look at how the Baltimore Sun sets the scene. Hall is packed. Ooh, it's just very the tension. You can cut the tension with a knife. The hall packed. Now look at this, y'all. Nearly 275 men and women, not counting children, packed the hall by 8 o'clock for the meeting and stayed until a complete plan of opposition to the Negro institution and colony had been perfected. A big delegation assured for today, and an emergency war fund of $71.50 was raised. The 50 cents was given by a woman. Women took active part in the town meeting and will be a large factor in the delegation today. And I just got to come off of this thing one more time to say women were involved. A lot of times we paint the picture that it's only white men, but white women were also engaged in Baltimore to help block this Black college from moving into this white community. And so 1917, so they're just trying to block. And they're trying to block Morgan College. This is what I was saying earlier. The former boundary of Baltimore was right here. That's roughly Cold Springs Lane. So Roland Park, Guilford, well, Guilford's down here, Homeland, Govans, Mount Washington, Laurelville, everything I've said so far, all of those areas are actually still in Baltimore County until 1918 when Baltimore completed its last annexation. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of both the city and Baltimore County were implicated. Urban and suburban partnering together to enforce urban apartheid. The next year, Baltimore subsumes, it annexes, and then all of this becomes a part of Baltimore City. Now, we go back to City Hall, and you may be asking, Dr. Brown, what is that language? What are they talking about, a colony? What colony are they talking about? And we go to this article from the Baltimore Sun. This is the colony. Mayor James Preston was proposing a suburban colony. He wanted to uproot some of those 90,000 Negroes and move them out to Baltimore County. He wanted to move. So we're not just talking about racial segregation, we're talking about forced displacement. He wanted to move them out. Well, Dr. Brown, why would he want to move Black people out? Once again, we go to the evidence. And so my field is implicated. My field, public health. The reason why is because now you have Dr. William T. Howard Jr., acting commissioner of health, presented statistics showing that the death rate among Negroes was nearly 100% greater than among white people due to conditions under which they live. Now, over here, let me see if I can, I want to try to zoom in a bit, but over here, there's this column of diseases and some odds ratios presenting the percentages increased death for Black people, for Negro race. So they're talking about tuberculosis, pneumonia, syphilis, influenza, poliomyelitis, whooping cough. And they're saying, look, Black people have more disease, so now we're going to use public health as a rationale for both racial segregation and effect as a quarantine to move them to areas where they're not living near us as a white community. And we're going to use it as a rationale to uproot African Americans and move them out to the county, out of sight, out of mind. So public health is implicated. My field is implicated. And this is in spite of the fact that public health actually understood the reasons why there were these health disparities. They said it right here, due to conditions under which they lived, the social determinants of health, the housing conditions. At this time, many African Americans were living, if you are familiar with the row homes in the city, there were often alley homes that were in the alleys, and they were wooden shacks. They didn't have plumbing, which means they didn't have clean water. The water system, they didn't have plumbing connected from the water filtration system, so the water wasn't being filtered. The alleys often they weren't paved yet. And the sewer system was just being installed in many alleyways throughout the city. So if you put two and two together, those are the conditions that allow infectious diseases like tuberculosis, whooping cough, yellow fever. The conditions are what allows pandemics and pathogens to spread, just like we have with the pandemic now. The reason that it is more lethal is because Black, brown, Native Americans are more vulnerable due to conditions under which they live. So public health is actually right on the money in terms of understanding why, but it's using that data, it's weaponizing that data to justify racial segregation. And so I heard that you all have a committee at the Women's Giving Circle. You have to watch and be careful. And everybody else that's on this webinar, you have to be careful how you use data. Data can be weaponized against marginalized, demonized people in our society. And this is a case study in just that very thing. And so I want to show you a picture. This is the man in the middle, James Preston, Mayor James Preston, standing on the steps. Him and his homeboys got their little suits on and everything, but there they are standing on the steps. Mayor James Preston, I want you to know who I'm talking about. That's who it is right there. Now, I have to say, James Preston was the most racist mayor in Baltimore City's history. Now, Dr. Brown, why would you say that? Because every time one plan didn't work, he came up with a new segregation plan. A new plan. He had a new plan every time the old one didn't work. He just kept trying to do it over and over again. And here it talks about everybody that was involved. Here we got to protect city's health. So we're talking about public health, my field. So the mayor, however, has conceived the idea of an ordinance. So look at how we're talking about policies. We're talking about the office of the mayor for Baltimore City, the laws that are passed in Baltimore City. And they passed this ordinance based upon a municipality's police power. So now you have the police involved because somebody has to enforce these ordinances. So you got the police to protect the health, public health. My field is involved. The health of its citizens, which was segregate Negroes in this city because having a much higher rate of tuberculosis among them than there is among the whites, they constitute a menace to the health of the white population. And it's just very striking, very clear that this was done to protect white public health. Segregation was a scheme because what happened is that Baltimore passed 4 ordinances because the courts kept throwing them out. And the first ordinance, we saw the rationales that was used, real estate devaluation. But when that didn't work, they shift to a new rationale, which was public health. And so that's what we're talking about. And it's very clear that the object was not to protect Black public health, but to protect white public health. So racism in my field. If any of you are familiar with Mercy Hospital, there used to be a Black community here called Gallows Hill. It was uprooted and replaced with this park. And the name of this park is called Preston's Gardens, named after Mayor James Preston. And of course, it's beautiful, but Black community was not around to enjoy it. Not around. So Mayor Preston, and I have to move past this just for the sake of time. Mayor Preston did both. He was a pioneer of racial segregation and a pioneer of forced displacement. Here we go, the Nebraska State Journal. Baltimore citizens, 1922, violently resent invasion of Negro. There's that language again. Moving forward, 1923, attack on Negroes' homes culminates in retaliation. I said it earlier, sometimes Black people would fight back. So there was always that fear and always that potential. And then in 1925, oh my goodness, the Ku Klux Klan came to march in Baltimore, and they were marching in the Hamden community. Now, Dr. Brown, how do you know that? Because again, I told you, I got the receipts. You got Union Avenue, Roland Avenue, right in the picture frame. Union and Roland is right there in Hamden. And this is hundreds of Klan members marching comfortably on the street. This is during the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. The first Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski County in Tennessee by the former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it was actually crushed by the winning general of the Union Army who had become President Ulysses S. Grant, when the Congress and they passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, or the Ku Klux Act in 1871, helping to crush the original Klan, but the Klan kept coming back again and again. So that was the second Klan marching comfortably in Baltimore, 1925. So now we're in 1937, June 1st, 1937 to be precise, and now the federal government gets involved. I don't know, let's see, somebody's using the chat. Y'all let me know how much time I have. I don't want to run over on time. And so now we have, okay, good. Yeah, you can put up like 5 or 10 just to let me know when I'm getting close. All right, and so now we have the federal government getting involved. And this, they're using NS Form -8, June the 1st, 1937, and they're raiding communities. And this is Central West Baltimore. See that? We're zooming into Upton. So this is near where Freddie Gray would live 60, 70 years later. And this community gets the grade of a D. Did anybody like getting D's on their report card? Anybody like getting D's? Anybody? Nobody here is, I know nobody here was a D student. So nobody likes getting D's on their report card, but this community was given a D. Why did it get a D, Dr. Brown? Detrimental influences, obsolescence, old housing, Negro concentration, excessive ground rents. Wait a minute, Negro concentration? So here on this federal document, a detrimental influence is having a concentration of Black people. And let's go further. Number 5, inhabitants. C, foreign born, mixture, 15%. The federal government is very concerned about these foreign born people. We're going to see more about that in a minute. Negro, yes, 80%. Infiltration of Negro. So this, listen to the language, Negro invasion, Negro concentration, infiltration of Negro. This language being used in media, in newspapers, in city, that informs city policy. And now we have the federal government involved, and this language is being used, and it's going to inform federal policy. So now we went over to Central East Baltimore. This community also gets the grade of a D, near Johns Hopkins, the medical center, medical campus. Detrimental influences, heavy concentration of foreigners. Very interesting. Why would a concentration of foreigners be negative? Foreign born, we come down here, foreign born, Italians, 25%. I gotta come back and talk to you directly once again. So basically we see that Other white European immigrants were being stigmatized as well. Italians, Polish folk, people coming from Ireland, Russian Jewish communities. When they first got to America, they were also stigmatized, demonized, marginalized. And we see that right here. This was a document created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which later becomes the Federal Housing Administration. So the federal government is using race, is using foreign-born status, and this is in the run-up to World War II. But by this time, America had already blocked, cut off a lot of immigration. So this would have been folks that had arrived maybe after World War One, who were trying to get out of Dodge. They're like, this Europe is a hot mess, is unstable. We got to get up and go and get to America, get to a land of opportunity. But they were demonized and stigmatized by the federal government. Here we go. Negro, yes, 25%. Infiltration of Negro once again. And so both foreign-born people and Black people are being stigmatized in this federal document, and it led to the most devastating map in Baltimore City's history, and that is the residential security map. And most people call it the redlining map, but you see 4 colors on this map: red, blue, yellow, and green. So residential security against what? Residential security from who? This map, if you read Antotella's book, Not in My Neighborhood, How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City, his book has a great chapter on the pseudoscience of eugenics that was the root of this map. In other words, there were racial ethnic groups connected to each of these 4 colors. White Anglo-Saxon in the green communities. Blue, remember the Jewish community was blocked from green, so many Jewish community folks were living in blue communities. They couldn't live in the green community. And other Anglo-Saxon white folks. Yellow often was reserved for those European immigrants I was telling you about. The Italians, the Irish, the Polish, the people who were trying to get out of Europe, get out of Dodge because they saw the writing on the wall before the next World War kicked off. And they're often relegated to these yellow communities, and then urban Native Americans and African Americans were relegated to these red communities. So the pseudoscience, the fake science of eugenics was a rationale that undergirded the creation of this color-coded map. And what this meant, in essence, this map dictated which communities received access to capital, to bank lending. So green and blue, they received privileged access. They received great terms on their loans. And they could receive loans for their homes. They could receive loans for their small businesses. And they're receiving this capital, privileged access year after year, decade after decade. And is it any surprise then that those neighborhoods are the ones that are flourishing today? But in the yellow and red communities, the banks didn't really want to see them. They did not. You come from a yellow community, it's kind of iffy. And if you live in a red community, oh no, we definitely don't want to see you come knocking at our door. And so the federal government undergirded bank lending after the Great Depression, World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDIC, putting economic protections in place. But when they put those protections in place, they did so using this racialized, color-coded mapping scheme. And so this map right here led to tremendous economic damage. And wait a minute, what's this? Okay, so we're looking at the legend. We got the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Again, that later becomes the Federal Housing Administration. The federal government, the United States government, helps create this map. But also, wait a minute, what's this over here in the other corner? Compiled with the assistance of data furnished by the Department of Public Works, Bureau of Plans and Services, City of Baltimore. Baltimore City helped the federal government red line, green line, blue line, and yellow line its own city. The city of Baltimore, the Department of Planning, helped the federal government red line. So now we see the role of the planning department. The city government has been playing a role in not making in helping to make Black neighborhoods not matter the way that they should. And it did so. I want to be very clear, because it's often, I think today we use a lot of language like structural racism, institutional racism, and that's all right. But I'm showing you in this presentation why there's a need for specificity. This was the policy: racial zoning, racially restrictive covenants. This was the map: red lining, yellow lining, blue lining, green lining, the pseudoscience that undergirded it, that determined access to capital. I want to challenge you in your work to go beyond the buzzword, go beyond the popular phrase, and get into, which is what I hope I do in my book, get into the very specific policies. This policy did that. That policy did this. And it's only by being very specific that we can hope to have and achieve the healing. And we're seeing all of the players that were involved: the police, public health, the mayor, the city council, the planning department, public health, the neighborhood associations. If I had more time, I'll talk about the churches, the white churches. Oh my goodness, the preachers and the pastors, the rabbis. They were helping, not all the rabbis, but many of the religious leaders. You see that I could show you articles showing you how religion also played a powerful role. So this means when we talk about solutions, because everybody, Dr. Brown, can you tell us the solution? No, the first thing we need to do is understand the problem and how your institution, whichever one you in, you may be in that neighborhood association, you may be in that church, you may be in the planning department, you may be on city council. Wherever you are, that is where you have to start. That is where you have to start and understand the role of your circle, whatever institution or agency that we may be talking about. And so this very map led to ongoing, because you say, oh, Dr. Brown, that was 80-something years ago. Okay, well, let's take a look at this. This is a Zillow analysis, and it's covering a period from 1997 to 2017, roughly 80 years after that map was created. And even today, we can see that the homes that are in those 4 color-coded areas still have a major impact. That map from 80 years ago still predicts home values today, with the homes in red-colored communities being well below the communities that are colored blue, green, and yellow. So this shows the ongoing impact that all the stuff that we talked about in the past, it accumulated because we never dismantled it. It metastasized because we never got rid of it. The damage is accumulating, and you can actually see, look at how the gap gets bigger. It's not getting better. You don't see the gap shrinking. The gap is getting bigger over time because we are playing around and we are not getting serious about undoing the damage that has been done. And there's a word for that: segronomics. Segronomics is a term. Let me come off of this so I can talk directly. A term developed by a scholar named Noliwe Rooks, and in her book, Cutting School. She uses it to talk about education. But I love the term so much, and I thought about it. I said, wait a minute, that's applying to all kinds of areas, not just education. We see that segronomics, which in my book I define, if we have any students on the call, I define it as the economic weaponization of racial segregation. Somebody ought to write that down or go circle it in my book. Segronomics is the economic weaponization. See, the damage of segregation is not that Black people, if they live in their own neighborhoods, can't be successful. That's not true. Black neighborhoods can be very successful. We don't necessarily have to have proximity to go and live in white communities to be successful. The problem with racial segregation is that once you segregate people, now you can economically redline, block capital, subprime, offer predatory capital. You can charge predatory rents, have check cashing facility, pawn shops, all of these predatory alternative financial institutions that are embedded and placed in Black communities. The preponderance of dangerous liquor stores, not the wine and cheese, but we talking about the 40 ounces and the hard liquor, that kind of liquor store that's placed in Black communities. That is the damage of segregation. Economically, what can be done after you segregate people. And that is what has been done in Black neighborhoods, not only in Baltimore, but in cities across America. But Baltimore is ground zero for urban American apartheid. And these are the specifics once again. Now, I want to tie this back because I started with condolences for the women and the people that were killed down in Atlanta just yesterday. And a lot of it really is rooted in racial rhetoric. Here we see some of that rhetoric. Negro invasion. I showed it to you throughout the presentation. Negro invasion, Negro concentration. That rhetoric then is used, it's enshrined in policy, is used to sanctify, justify violence against people. And the language that has been used in America are slurs like the China virus, Kung flu, and it was directed against our Asian American brothers and sisters. And once that language was used, it sent a signal for people to commit violence, just like that language was used as a signal to commit lethal physical violence and economic violence against African Americans. So when we say that we have to deal with, we're talking about dealing with things at a very deep level in media, in our culture, the language that we use to demonize and stigmatize people that then gets used as justification for violence, again, both against the body and against people structurally and economically. So I think I'm going to stop right there. I'll summarize basically by saying this is the thesis of my book. We cannot make Black lives matter if we don't make Black neighborhoods matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I know that just scratches the surface. I too have a book that is full of stickies and marks and everything else. So I first want to thank you both for being with us today, but really for writing this book. It is extraordinary in the detail that it gives all of us to be able to sort of put our heads around where our families, our friends, our neighborhoods played a role and continue to play a role in this apartheid of Baltimore and our surrounding communities. So I'm going to pose a few questions that have been placed in the chat box. And I'm not go in any orders, but I want to ask, how did the religious leaders play a role in establishing and maintaining segregation, and through the fearful images that they reinforced by the press threatening race war?
That is a great question. You see me looking,
right?
Because I may be able to pull up an article to show just that. So it's not that I'm not paying attention. I'm looking to see if I can find.
I'll let you look, because one of the things that I think is interesting is we can talk about sort of the move that the Episcopal Church has started to take, in particular in Baltimore,
yes.
because the cathedral here was moved literally from the neighborhood of Freddie Gray in around 1910, around that period of time when all of this started to happen, where the invasion, as they said.
Right.
So they moved their property right to the edge of Guilford, like right over the line, as soon as those lines were drawn. And so they, in recognition of that, they are working through a really deep process and reparations for what they did when they left and abandoned those neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And I spoke to them November of 2019, outlining what I'm about to show you right now, the role that the Episcopal Church played in segregation. They had been doing work around the church's role in segregation.
Right.
And so I showed them, around slavery, and I showed them how the churches were involved in segregation. So this is a good article to show that. So this is the Baltimore Sun, 1924. There's a meeting in Lafayette, West Baltimore. Now the Lafayette Square Protective Association, they're discussing the invasion of the Negro. And look at what we have here. The meeting will be held at Brantley Baptist Church. So one way that the churches played a role is that they hosted. They said, come on in the church house with your segregation stuff. Come on and let's have a meeting. And y'all can do it right here. So you had that. You also had churches. There were a group of 5 churches that wrote a letter. They wrote a letter and they bemoaned the fact that Black people were moving in. And they said, this is, and I saw this in the Howard Jackson files at the Baltimore City Archives, this letter from churches where they basically said that, let me see, well, that's not it. 4 churches, segregation pact. Well, this is another example I'm going to pull up momentarily, but the churches wrote a letter and said, well, these Negroes moving in is going to undermine the religious value of our institutions. And so it's like, oh my goodness. So they were lobbying for racial segregation. They were hosting meetings for racial segregation. And then in this article, we see how these 4 churches signed a segregation pact. Even the hospital was favoring the segregation plan. Now, Dr. Brown, what 4 churches are you talking about? Right here.
Yep.
The churches are, see, I like having the receipts, because then nobody can say, well, you're making it up. No, it's right here in the article. The churches are Franklin Street Methodist Episcopal. So this is the kind of thing, I believe Reverend Gray actually shared this article with me, but this is a powerful point. It's great when institutions are ready to take accountability for what their institution has done.
Right.
It's not about, feeling guilty and, bemoaning, like you didn't do this, unless you were way back and was as a child or something saying, yeah, mama, go ahead on and do that racist thing. Unless you did that, you didn't do this, right? These institutions did this. And so that's why we have to hold these. It's good when the institutions say we want to hold ourselves accountable, which is what the diocese of the Maryland Diocese of the Episcopal Church, which is what they did. But yeah, we have here Franklin Street Methodist Episcopal, St. Pius Catholic, Memorial United Evangelical, and then the Concordia Evangelical Lutheran. So we have a cornucopia of religious institutions that have just played a role in, and I even somewhere, oh my goodness, in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan started a church in Harford County. In Harford County, the Klan had a church. I got to show that to y'all for the end, so you don't think I'm making it up. But yeah, so the churches were heavily involved.
So the city services and schools in the red districts, like how did that work? I mean, if they were part of the school system, but they were in red-lined areas, what happened? What was the treatment or difference between those and the city services that were provided or ever provided in those areas? And I think this gets to there's a place in your book where you do some math. The one, I really love your book. There's a lot of math in there that makes sense. And so talk about sort of the difference between the percentage given to redline communities or Black communities and white communities in terms of city services and schools.
Right. Before I get to that, here's that article. Baltimore Sun, August 24th, 1924, the first Klan church in state dedicated in Harford County. So you had the Grand Dragon, the Kleagles, the Titans, the Cyclopses. They were all gathering in a field near Webster for the ceremony in a field near Harvard of Grace. And so, and it gives the whole breakdown. Reverend Mr. Sutcliffe, he was one of the reverends at the first Klan church in Maryland. I mean, this is
Yeah, and I will say, and I don't think I'm alone in saying this, that some of us too, I'm fourth generation Maryland. So there is family tie, or actually further back than that on the other side, but there are a lot of ties to what happened in this era.
Right.
What we don't want to do is get stuck in that.
Right.
What I like is you've got receipts, so you can give us the bill. Right.
Right.
So
I just want to share, I'm not making it up. The Klan had a church.
Correct.
As crazy as that is, the Ku Klux Klan had a church.
But
yeah, to your question around math.
Public services. Yeah.
Well, actually, a few years ago, now Delegate Stephanie Smith, who I believe is still with the city's budget department, the study outlining the public capital budget spending in Baltimore City. And what she found in her study was that, not counties, neighborhoods that are more than 75% white had almost twice as much public capital budget spending compared to communities that were over 75% communities of color. So the public capital budget is what's used to fix like infrastructure. So you're talking about in our schools when the children don't have heat and AC, that comes from the public capital budget. I mean, the state provides some funding too, but the capital budget is one way that can be helped. The capital budget can help fix libraries, not streets because that's transportation, but infrastructure for the city, for our schools, rec centers. And so, which is also coming out of Parks and Rec, but the buildings would have been coming out of the public capital budget to fix those centers. And so when you look at the conditions of our schools, particularly in red line communities, and the disproportionate spending that goes to communities in the white L, and how she documented that like 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, if it's happening 4 or 5 years ago, imagining what was happening 40, 50, 70 years ago. So I think her study provides good, empirical documentation that it's not just private redlining by banks, but also public redlining by the city of Baltimore.
And there was a question about, were there alternative banking solutions for Black residents of Baltimore? Were they able to fill voids, or was it not adequate to fulfill the needs?
Yes, I mean, certainly banks were able to fill the void in some instances, but also like wealthy Black individuals like William Adams, I believe his wife was Victorine Adams, and who becomes a Democratic city council member. But like wealthy Black business owners oftentimes, were able to finance maybe homes or small businesses for Black Baltimoreans. So they fill in the gap for some, but obviously, any wealthy individual in the Black community can't overcome the types of dynamics that I discussed.
Right.
Because remember, it's not like these things stopped. Redlining stopped, subpriming stopped. They kept going on. I mean, you can heal when those things aren't happening anymore. But as I showed you with that Zillow analysis, they're ongoing. And so that's a big part of why Black self-sufficiency efforts, and there are many Black people we want to do for ourselves. We don't want, anybody giving us anything. But when you have government and landlords and banks that are still denying capital, that creates a hole that African-American communities cannot dig out of by themselves.
Yeah.
And that is why we have to have these institutions, government stepping in to actually level the playing field.
Can you talk about the lead problem that you described in Baltimore in the book? Because I think that one of the things that struck me about it was that it's still as bad as it is, and how it can be fixed. It's not so insurmountable that it could be taken care of if there was a will to do it.
Absolutely. You know, coming out of public health, you know, toxic lead exposure, that's the thing that really scares me, because babies are poisoned. Baby toddlers, you know, lead tastes sweet like candy, which is why the Romans used to put their wine in lead laden, you know, vessels and things, which was a contributing factor to the decline of the Roman civilization and empire. So, you know, lead, then we know that scientifically it has a devastating cognitive impact on the human brain. It decreases people's ability to regulate their emotions. So then you have increased aggressivity, increased impulsivity, which then is going to lead to more violence. Like, oh, you stepped in my shoe, pop! Hey man, why you stepped in my shoe? That was the first thing that came to my mind. It's hard to regulate my emotions when I got this toxic heavy metal that does not belong in the human body at all in the brain.
Yeah.
Research also shows that it has a devastating impact on the executive reasoning portion of the brain as well. So the part of the brain that says, I'm going to make a good decision as opposed to a dumb decision, that part of the brain is devastated as well. Now, it doesn't mean that people who are impacted by that aren't able to go to college, for instance. Corinne Gaines, who was killed by the Baltimore County Police in 2016, lead poison in Baltimore City, she made it to Morgan State. So it's not to say that you don't find intelligent or intelligence in folks who have toxic lead exposure. You can and you do. But the point is that it diminishes, it lowers, it impacts in a very devastating way. So a lot of people talk about the school to prison pipeline. I say it's the toxic lead exposure to school to prison pipeline, because it's impacting your ability to focus, it's impacting your ability to learn, cognitive brain impact, therefore it's impacting your ability to graduate, get better jobs, go to college, that sort of thing. So solutions, we got to get rid of toxic lead. We got to get it out of the environment. You know, Flint was just the surface. You know, Baltimore, we have lead still in our water. That's why children in schools, now that we're back in schools, children can't drink out of the water fountain.
Right.
They give out bottled water in our schools. Why? Because lead is in the pipes in the school.
So it's interesting,
right?
because the question just popped up, and I'm going to pose it to you.
Sure.
And I think it's sort of what it's a moment which all of us have had, where it says, isn't there a law against that? Right. And the fact that the policies and the practices and the systemic embedding of racism has prevented from laws that are even on the books from impacting Black communities. So do you want to just respond to that a little bit?
I mean, if you mean like, I don't know.
I mean, there are ordinances and things, but they're not necessarily carried out or imposed, or people are not held accountable in certain communities for seeing that there is no lead.
I know there's, like, with housing, lead paint violations that can be issued against landlords, for instance. Like if you're renting a home that has toxic lead on the wall and the paint, especially to a family with children, you know, that kind. And the Baltimore Sun reported a few years back how people were faking their lead inspections and getting somebody to say that the home was lead free when it's written with lead, and then they renting it out to people.
Yeah.
So yeah, either sometimes some of the laws are on the book. Some of the laws are either not enforced, or, you know, we don't have, you know, like lead testing. The governor passed a couple years ago that every child under age 1 and 2 should be tested for lead. Only about half of all babies are tested, you know. So there's a law. Sometimes there's a need to have the law in the book. Other times there's a need to make sure the laws are actually enforced in some serious way. And you know, well, I don't want to get into COVID.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, just for that sort of piece of information, your your book was amazing, because it's very
Right.
detailed about what the problem is and what needs to be done to rectify it. We have in the last
Let me
moments that we
go.
have, there you
I'm
go.
going to say real quick, because you
Yeah,
asked
that's why
about.
I wanted to switch to this and also talk about, in the last minutes we have, philanthropy's role in both this piece in general, because that's really what this group is about. So I'll leave you to bring us all home.
Sure, because this graph actually includes both. So part of this $3 billion racial equity social impact bond is getting rid of lead, almost half of it. Over here on the right side, eliminate lead. We're talking about lead in the air, the water, the soil, and in the homes, lead paint. And we can hire people to do that work. And that's almost 1.5 billion, half of this. What can philanthropy do? Donate to this bond, this fund, to get it done. That's what philanthropy can do. I like philanthropy in terms of, it's great that, there's scholarships and all arts and all the good, beautiful things. But, what I showed you on this racial equity social impact bond graphic, these issues get to the root. This getting rid of lead is getting to the root of so much of our issues with academic achievement and crime and violence. As long as we don't deal with toxic lead, we are not dealing with the root issues around academic achievement and crime and violence. Over here, here's $100 million for violence prevention, boosting safe street sites, other issues other things, components that communities need to survive, permanent housing for people without homes, 500 million, eliminating transit, biking, and food apartheid, 255 million. So I encourage philanthropy to actually deal with root causes and actually to make sure you're funding those things that help communities thrive, not just an individual program, not just a nice little scholarship. And those things are great, but if we're talking about changing and turning communities around, we have to get to the root causes and deal with the apartheid constructs that's actually diminishing and holding so many communities back.
So would you think that Baltimore also needs a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to really help all of us face everything that's been done and continues to be done, and to figure out how every individual can sort of be part of this reckoning, and also this reparations, and also just healing as a community?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that. But my sense of it, my thinking is not one, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think there needs to be truth and reconciliation work and effort broadly. I mean, every type of institution that I showed throughout my presentation, like we need truth and reconciliation in public health. We need truth and reconciliation in housing. We need truth and reconciliation with neighborhood associations. Every institution and agency that played a role, churches, should be like the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Diocese should be investigating its own history. What did we do? What role did we play? And then determining, just like the Episcopal Diocese did, how are we going to make amends? How are we going to help repair the damage that we caused? And I think that's the approach that I would recommend. Not one big commission, but every institution and large, especially the ones that have a long history, because you can actually sometimes find, documents and minutes of meetings and things that specific institution did that contributed.
Well, in philanthropy, I mean, I say all the time that philanthropy needs to take the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. And then we've done harm. And so really looking back and understanding that to understand how we move forward. We'd like to know if we can post that slide again. Because that's, we'd love to be able to share that and give people more time. Yeah, and give people more time to understand it. And so we'd love to be able to share that more broadly with the membership as well after this. If that's
sure. Yeah, I'll send it an email.
That'd be great, because I think, there's so much in the book. There's so many pieces of this. And I wrote, you have a list on how to heal the black butterfly. and you break down the bond, the social impact bond, and I'm writing notes about what's public, private, and government, what's more government, what's more, but it's going to take, to your really beautiful point, it's going to take every institution that created this to fix it.
Yes.
So in partnership with Black communities who need to be able to do the planning for their communities and the investments for their communities. So Dr. Brown, we can't thank you enough. We wish we had many, many more hours to chat. It is a lot of information. Please, please, if you care about Baltimore, you need to spend some time with this book. And so really, really appreciate it. And now I am turning it back over, I believe, to Leslie to bring us home. So thank you again, Dr. Brown.
Thank you all. I really appreciate you.